As an independent institution of higher education and a registered body, Cambridge Muslim College relies on its friends, patrons and supporters from across the UK and beyond. Help Cambridge Muslim College train the next generations of future thinkers, scholars and leaders, and continue delivering education series like our Ramadan programming. You can support our vital work by becoming a friend or patron, or by giving a one-off donation, whatever the amount, or you can also pay your zakat to the college, directly benefiting students in need. Visit cambridgemuslimcollege.ac.uk/donate and donate today. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. My name is Shoaib, and this is the final session of the God, Islam and Science series. So if you've been able to follow me this far, and I do apologize if it's been overtly very technical, but that's just the nature of the subject matter, today we'll be concluding all those thoughts that we looked at in sessions 1, 2, and 3. If you recall from the previous session, we started something called the contingency argument. And I said in that session that there are two parts to that argument. Part 1 is starting from contingency, which if you recall means we can imagine an entity to be other than what it is. It could have different properties. You can imagine it non-existing, therefore it's contingent. And through a line of reasoning, we approach the conclusion that all contingencies must eventually terminate, stop, be caused by a necessary being. In this session, we'll be starting from that necessary being and work our way to God. Now, when we understand God, we have several attributes that come to mind, right? And of course, this is not the place to go through all of those attributes exhaustively, but here are some. We believe that God is immaterial. We believe God is non-temporal, he's not in time. We believe God is omnipotent. We believe God is omniscient. We believe God is one. Those are 5 properties. So how do we go from the necessary being to these 5 properties? Let's start off with the first 2, that God is immaterial and God is non-temporal, not in time. Well, think about it. If God did have material dimensions to him, it would indicate that he would have contingencies. Why does he have this kind of material as opposed to this material? Why does he have these kinds of sizes as opposed to those kinds of sizes? In other words, materiality implies contingency, and therefore the necessary being cannot have that. And the reason why we say that is because you cannot have an entity that is both necessary and contingent at the same time. So the necessary being cannot be material. He has to be immaterial, number 1. Number 2, God cannot be in time because the necessary being would then have to experience moments of time. Me and you, for example, are in this moment. We're sharing experience, right? We will be in another moment where we have different experiences. We were in other moments where we've had different past histories, right? But God is not an entity that has a temporal aspect to him. It would imply that he is contingent. Therefore, we believe that the necessary being must be non-temporal, outside of time. So if you've been following so far, right, I indicated 5 things which we usually believe are attributes of God. Him being immaterial, him being non-temporal. And I just reviewed the first to show that God cannot be a material or a temporal entity, because to say that would indicate that he is contingent. And that is against the very nature of a necessary being, which is intrinsically fixed as it is. Now, let's look at the next 2 properties, omnipotence and omniscience. Now, those may be big words. Fundamentally, these are words we already know. Allah is Al-Qadir, Al-Qadir, Al-Muqtadir, right? That he's all-powerful. That is what we mean by omnipotence. Allah is Al-Alim. He is all-knowing. That is what we mean by omniscience, right? How can we say the necessary being must be those things? Well, think carefully about it. Imagine if the necessary being had not, say, everlasting power or all kinds of power. Let's just say the necessary being was 90% powerful, right? If you say that, it would mean that that entity can be overpowered by an entity potentially that is 91%, or even underpowered, right? And that implies what? Contingency. The necessary being by its very nature cannot be other than what it is. If you say that the necessary being has deficient power, then that entity could be other than what it is. Could be overpowered, could be underpowered. And as a result, the necessary being entails it must be all-powerful. Similarly, you take the same line of reasoning, apply it to knowledge. If you say the necessary being has 50% knowledge, not 100% knowledge or all knowledge, you could then say, well, then that entity can have more knowledge or less knowledge. And that implies what? Contingency. So you can see here, once you've absorbed the concepts of contingency, you can see that the necessary being cannot fundamentally possess those attributes. The necessary being cannot be immaterial, therefore he's immaterial. The necessary being cannot be temporal, therefore he is non-temporal. The necessary being cannot have partial power, therefore he is omnipotent. The necessary being cannot have partial knowledge, therefore he's omniscient. So we've at least hit 4 attributes. Now the final attribute is, okay, Shoaib, you've somehow convinced us that the necessary being is immaterial, non-temporal, omnipotent, and omniscient. How do you say that he's one? How do you know he's one? This is where we come into a very interesting argument, right? And this argument involves a conceptual analysis where you posit 2 necessary beings in a scenario and see what the entailments of that are, okay? So I want you to imagine you have a necessary being A and you have necessary being B, right? Now you could imagine, for the sake of the argument, that necessary being A creates a world down here and necessary being creates a world down here, in which case they can create their own world, no problemo. Okay, that doesn't seem to be problematic. But if we really want to assess that there can be indeed 2 necessary beings, what you want to do is you posit them into a conflict, and then you see the implications off of that. And only with those implications can you then evaluate, can there really be more than one necessary being, yea or nay? So, if we do put them in conflict, let's put them at maximum conflict, right? Let's say the necessary being A wants to create a world where all of creation is black, let's just say. Necessary being B wants to create that very same creation where all that creation is white. So we have total opposites here. Necessary being A wants to create all of this as white, as black. Necessary being B wants to create all of this as white. What are the possible outcomes? There are 4 logical outcomes here. Logical outcome number 1, both of their wills are manifested. That's one option, right? Let's first put these on the table. Option number 2 is that none of their wills are manifested. And then options 3 and 4 are the same, where one's will is manifested, the other one's is not, and vice versa. This one's is manifested, the other one's is not. Those are the only 4 logical outcomes. So let's evaluate each one of them one by one. Option number 1, both of their wills are manifested. So necessary being A wills that this world is completely black. Necessary being B wills that all of this entire thing is white. That is a logical contradiction. If you recall from the previous sessions, we do believe that contradictions do not exist. Contradictions are the benchmark of how we view and evaluate reality. As a result, option 1 is pretty much wrong. So we say that's not possible. Let's go to option number 2. Option number 2 says that both of their wills do not manifest because they cancel each other out. In this case then it becomes clear that none of them are necessary beings, because as we said earlier, the necessary being must be all-powerful. But here, on this occasion, they've been trumped by each other. Hence they cannot be all-powerful. Hence they are no longer necessary beings. So that means it must be either option 3 or 4, where one is a necessary being, and that necessary being trumps the other entity, right? In which case, that entity that is trumped is not really a necessary being. That entity is contingent. So let me take a step back in case that wasn't clear. We said we want to see whether there actually is a single necessary being or if there can be more. To do this, we did a conceptual analysis. I say posit two necessary beings and put them into conflict to see if there actually can be two necessary beings in place. So we said necessary being A wants to create a world that is completely black. Necessary being B wants to create a world that's completely white. And we put them at maximum conflict to see exactly what the implications are. We said there are four outcomes, possible outcomes. First outcome is the idea that both of their worlds are manifested. We said this was impossible because this is a logical contradiction. Option number two was that both of their worlds are cancelled. They cancel each other out. In which case, none of them are necessary beings because of our earlier evaluation that the necessary being must be all-powerful. If it's not, it's contingent. Since both of these entities trumped one another, they can no longer be necessary beings. Therefore, it must be option 3 or 4, in which case the net result is the same. There is fundamentally only one necessary being, and the other entity really wasn't a necessary being. It was a contingent being because it was trumped. So if you put all that together, that means the necessary being can only be one. And by extension, if you say there cannot be two necessary beings, there cannot be also 3, 4, 5, and on number of beings. The necessary being can only be one. So, if you've been following me so far, right, we are walking through stage 2 of the argument, right, which is supposed to complement our analysis that we did in the previous session. In this particular video, I wanted to walk you through how we go from the necessary being to God. And I said, when we understand God, there are several attributes, of course, that you can put on paper, but the 5 that I wanted to analyze with you, at least for the sake of, an easy enough explanation, are the idea that God is immaterial, God is non-temporal, God is omnipotent, God is omniscient, and God is one. And we use several lines of reasoning to show where that necessary being must have these features because of the nature of a necessary being. If the necessary being was material, it would imply contingency. That cannot be God. If the necessary being was in time, that would imply change. That cannot be God. If that necessary being was partial in power, that could mean the necessary being could be overpowered or underpowered, therefore could not be God. If the necessary being had partial knowledge, it could be developing new knowledge or it could even lose knowledge. Therefore, that cannot be God. So fundamentally, we believe that the necessary being must have characteristics by its very nature of it being immaterial, non-temporal, omnipotent, and omniscient. We then concluded through another line of reasoning that that necessary being must be one. We posited 2 necessary beings together, we evaluated the conclusions, and arrived at the point where we said the necessary being can only be one. So I really hope after all this you can appreciate that there is at least a line of reasoning that convinces us or provides us with enough justification to assert that there is a God. And we have evidence for God's existence, right? Now, I do apologize if that was, very abstract, philosophical, but if you've been able to follow me this far, then you'll be able to appreciate what's going to come now. I started this series by saying that we have a serious challenge because of the contemporary landscape that we live in. We live in a landscape where atheism is on the rise. This is a cause of concern for many Muslims around the world. I myself, I'm a parent. I have a 7-year-old son. When I'm recording this, I have a 7-year-old son. I'm worried about the kind of future he's getting into. I'm worried about the future of Muslims. As a result of this, I do believe it is important that we equip ourselves with the intellectual tools that our tradition has to offer, as well as contemporary engagements. If we don't engage with this conversation, we might be putting ourselves in a very sensitive situation in which people start losing faith, maybe having doubts that eventually make them lose faith. And I think that's a situation that all of us should be worried about. It is for this reason I wanted to provide this series so that at least we have an accessible overview to at least one argument for God's existence, which I hope by the end of this series you can appreciate. Now, where does the application of this argument come in? This is what I'm going to discuss now. If you have been able to understand the distinction between contingency, the necessary being, and how the necessary being must be God, you will now easily see that everything is grounded by Allah's existence. When you think of things like laws of nature, when you think of things like miracles, when you think of things that are designed around us, when you even think of things that are part of the ghaib, the unseen world, we begin to see all of these things are contingent. Everything here is grounded by Allah, the necessary being, right? And this actually forms the denominator between miracles and laws of nature. As a former STEM student, professor, I always used to think about how can I be a scientist and yet believe in miracles? I was very confused by that. Before learning theology, it really, made me think, how does that situation work? How does that relationship work? But once you understand at least the contingency argument, once you're able to appreciate what these theological tools can do for you, you can then very easily see the fundamental denominator between laws of nature and miracles are that they are both contingent. And if they're both contingent, then you can start the chain of reasoning to see both of them are grounded by the necessary being. That is Allah. Similarly, things that are in the unseen, right? Allah can create things that are not necessarily observable by us. All of those are grounded by Allah in the necessary being. That's point number one. Point number two, if you've been able to follow these 4 sessions, you should be able to now realize that nothing, absolutely nothing in science can undermine your belief in Allah's existence. Nothing. Why? Because science only deals with contingencies. If we discover atoms, if we discover the periodic table, if we discover multiverses, if we discover quantum mechanics, relativity, are they contingent? Yes or no? Everything in science is contingent. So to say we have a scientific theory, therefore now we have a basis for undermining God's existence is complete rubbish. These are 2 categorically different explanations. Science deals with contingencies and the necessary being is a different category altogether. So whenever you come across certain viewpoints in which science is being used to undermine God's existence, then be very clear that that can never be the case. All that science gives us is an explanation of contingencies based on other contingencies. How do we understand matter? We know it through atoms, another form of contingencies. How do we understand laws of nature? They are forms of contingencies. How do we understand quantum mechanics? All based on contingencies, virtual particles, whatever it may be. So nothing in science can ever undermine Allah's existence. Nothing. Finally, I wanted to say that the net conclusion of all of this is that whatever it is that atheists are throwing at Muslims with respect to science instrumentalization or saying there's no proof for God's existence, here is at least one way of arguing against that. The contingency argument, in my view, has a double benefit in that it can give you a solid proof once you've digested the material. And again, I do apologize if this is a little bit philosophical, but if you've digested that material really well and really soaked it in, there is a very strong line here in proving God's existence that has very clear implications for all of these Islam and science conversations. So to take a step back, I'll tail it off and go back to what I said in the very first session. Atheism is a very real threat, and I do believe that it's a conversation that we as Muslims need to confront head on. I think we also need to have real academic dialogue and nurturing of minds and of hearts. And I hope that this series has provided at least one dimension of that by going through what is the contingency argument. Please do forgive me if this was overly technical. It has been a challenge for me to really speak to a camera to be able to express all this. Usually I do this in a classroom setting, but I hope that this has been beneficial. I sincerely hope that you've been able to at least gather some confidence that you do have something to fall back on if you've never encountered these arguments before. And I wish you a wonderful Ramadan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Ramadan provides us with an invaluable opportunity to increase our piety, our God consciousness. It is also an opportune time to give generously in charity. As an independent institution of higher education and a registered charity, our work relies on the generosity of individuals like you. During this blessed month, we ask you to support Cambridge Muslim College. You can do so through regular giving, by becoming a friend or patron, or one-off donations, whatever the amount. This Ramadan, our goal is to make 10,000 new friends. Head to the donate page on our website, become a friend for as little as £5 a month, and help us continue delivering educational programs like this for the wider community, training the next generation of Muslim scholars, thinkers, and leaders.